You fought with less and still made the powerful people panic because power never truly belonged to them. It only worked on those who believed in it. You saw the illusion. They sat behind walls of status and influence, mistaking insulation for invincibility, never realizing that protection breeds weakness. You had no safety net, no comfort to dull your hunger, and that's why you moved differently. They looked at your lack of resources as limitation, but that lack sharpened you. They relied on structure. You relied on instinct. They had money to command fear. You had pain that trained precision. The irony is that the one with nothing becomes the most dangerous because they've learned to operate without dependency. The powerful began to sense it. The imbalance between their comfort and your conviction. Comfort dulls. Conviction terrifies. They underestimated what desperation mixed with discipline creates. You didn't have their tools, but you had their weaknesses mapped. You studied their routines, their comfort zones, their blind spots. While they flaunted their advantages, you learned their habits. You realized early that power's greatest flaw is predictability. It gets used to being obeyed. You didn't challenge them directly. You let them expose themselves through arrogance. Every empire falls not from invasion, but from the decay within. You became the reflection of what they feared, someone immune to intimidation. When people in high places meet someone who cannot be bought, guilted, or shamed, panic is inevitable. You made them question their own stability just by standing firm. Your silence was the loudest weapon. They expected defiance, expected shouting, expected resistance they could label and crush. But you gave them composure instead. You forced them to deal with someone who didn't react. That unsettled them more than open rebellion ever could. Powerful people depend on your reaction. It confirms their control. You denied them that validation. Every calm stare, every slow response, every refusal to flinch became a psychological strike. They started to overthink, to second guess, to wonder what you knew that they didn't. You gave them nothing but mystery, and mystery breeds fear faster than any weapon. They built their power on perception, and you shattered that perception by showing no sign of defeat. They thought resources define results. You proved that focus does. You didn't scatter energy trying to match their lifestyle or outshine their influence. You used precision. You picked your moments. You conserved energy like a strategist, not a fighter. When you moved, it mattered. When you spoke, it landed. They had abundance but wasted it. You had little but maximized it. Power often drowns in excess because those who have everything forget how to fight efficiently. You remembered. You turned scarcity into discipline, and that discipline became dominance. They had more tools, but you had mastery, and mastery always outlasts luxury. Psychology explains why they panicked. Power is fragile when it depends on validation. The powerful surround themselves with admiration to maintain illusion, but the presence of one unshakable individual cracks that illusion. Your lack of awe threatened their social balance. People around them began to notice the contrast, you with composure, them with insecurity disguised as confidence. You didn't attack their authority. You exposed it as hollow by refusing to worship it. That subtle rebellion spread faster than open resistance. It reminded others that authority collapses without followers. You became proof that fear evaporates when awareness awakens. They felt that shift in the air, the slow loss of control, and it frightened them more than any confrontation ever could. They called you reckless, but it was precision disguised as chaos. You didn't charge recklessly into battles. You waited, observed, and struck when advantage tilted your way. They thought you were reacting emotionally, but every move was mathematical. They couldn't predict you because you didn't play by their hierarchy's logic. Power thrives on predictability, on people staying within assigned roles. You tore through those boundaries with logic sharper than privilege. While they looked down on you, you looked through them. You saw the cracks, the dependencies, the insecurities they dressed in authority. They mistook comfort for intelligence. You made them realize intelligence doesn't come from what you have. It comes from how you adapt. Your strength was forged where theirs could never survive, in loss, in hunger, in rejection. Every setback trained your nervous system for chaos. They never had to rebuild. They never had to lose everything and still move forward. That's why they panic when pressure comes. You became stormproof. They became fragile beneath their gold-plated armor. You learned to turn pain into focus. They used distraction to avoid it. You learned to embrace solitude. They need crowds to feel powerful. When power meets presence, power trembles. You taught them that endurance without entitlement is more frightening than status with no soul behind it. Their panic wasn't about you winning. It was about realizing how much they had lost without you taking anything. You didn't have to defeat them. You only had to remain standing when they expected collapse. That survival alone discredited their systems. Their metrics of success crumbled because you succeeded outside of them. They called it luck to mask their confusion. But luck doesn't move with strategy, doesn't think 10 steps ahead, doesn't rebuild from every hit stronger than before. They panicked because your existence made them irrelevant. You became living evidence that power can be reclaimed without permission. In conversation, they start to tread lightly. They study you like an unpredictable variable. Their tone shifts, their confidence falters. They ask questions not to learn but to gauge. They feel the imbalance now, you with nothing to prove them, with everything to lose. That dynamic exposes hierarchy for what it really is. A fragile agreement maintained by belief. You stop believing. They lost control. That's all it takes. Your refusal to play along stripped their cleverness of purpose. When you withdrew your energy, their system collapsed into silence. You made their structures obsolete simply by no longer feeding them. Their arguments lost rhythm when you stopped playing the part they wrote for you. They built entire conversations on the assumption that you'd react a certain way, that you'd get flustered, emotional, defensive. But when you didn't, the air shifted. Their words, once fluid and rehearsed, started tripping over each other. They reached for insults that sounded weaker, explanations that made less sense, tones that wavered. You saw the panic behind their logic. Their confidence depended on your confusion. When you didn't feed it, the performance fell apart. You didn't outtalk them. You outlistened them. You watched the tempo of their manipulation crumble, and that silence, that cold patience, broke the illusion of their control faster than confrontation ever could. They were used to debates where noise wins. They relied on rhythm, the rise and fall of voice, the interruption, the dominance in timing. You dismantled that rhythm with calm. You didn't rush to fill the pauses they left. You let the silence expose their insecurity. That silence made their words echo louder than they meant. They realized too late that their arguments were never built on truth, but on pressure. When pressure vanished, so did persuasion. They looked at you, expecting to find the old version, the one who explained, justified, apologized, but found someone unmoved. And when a manipulator loses rhythm, they lose identity, because their entire sense of power depends on keeping others spinning. You stood still, and they collapsed. They mistook emotional control for detachment. What they failed to understand was that emotional control is the foundation of power. You learned to regulate what they weaponized. They tried to provoke anger. You gave neutrality. They tried to guilt you. You gave perspective. Every attempt they made to steer the conversation returned to them like a mirror, reflecting their weakness instead of yours. That loss of rhythm created panic. Their mouths kept moving, but even they could hear the dissonance in their tone. They began to contradict themselves, repeat themselves, reach for old tactics that no longer worked. It was no longer a debate. It was a slow unraveling of a script that had lost its purpose. When rhythm breaks, truth leaks. You saw how they began to stumble, how the pauses grew longer, how frustration replaced fluency. That's when people reveal their real intentions, not when they're confident, but when they're cornered by calm. They wanted control, not clarity. They wanted dominance, not dialogue. And when you refused to feed that, their rhythm turned chaotic. You didn't even need to prove your point. They proved it for you by spiraling. Every manipulator fears silence, because silence is honesty's stage. The rhythm they once used to hypnotize others became a desperate noise that betrayed them. You didn't destroy them. You made them face the truth of their own incoherence. Their rhythm depended on your validation. Every manipulator counts on emotional reciprocity, the reassurance that you're still caught in their dance. You ended the dance. You walked away mid-step and their momentum crashed. You left them talking to themselves, arguing with ghosts, replaying scenarios that never earned your attention again. Without your energy, their rhythm died like a drumbeat without an echo. That's the thing about psychological warfare. It doesn't take a loud victory. It takes stillness that reveals dependency. They depended on your reactions to feel relevant. When you stopped reacting, you didn't just win the argument. You erased their audience. They once prided themselves on articulation, on being able to twist logic so elegantly that truth bent under the pressure. But every trick loses potency with exposure. You'd seen those tactics before, in different faces, different tones, different masks. You stopped listening to words and started observing intent. That's when rhythm died. They couldn't dance around someone who understood the steps. They thought clever phrasing could still manipulate you. But you heard emptiness beneath it. You recognized rehearsed language, moral posturing, fake empathy. Their rhythm faltered because they couldn't find footing in authenticity. They'd never learned it. And against authenticity, performance always collapses. Psychologically, what you did dismantled their nervous system. Manipulators operate through rhythm because rhythm keeps their targets emotionally engaged. When you broke that pattern, their brain lost its advantage. They entered survival mode, speech quickened, tone cracked, logic scattered. You watched their words turn frantic, their expressions tighten. What used to sound like dominance began to sound like desperation. They weren't arguing anymore. They were pleading for the illusion of control. Your calm rewired the dynamic. You didn't just change the conversation. You changed the hierarchy. They went from predator to performer, from manipulator to self-exposer. That shift is irreversible once it happens. They started to realize that all along, rhythm was their disguise. They thought control came from clever phrasing, from persuasive rhythm, from charisma. But power built on rhythm crumbles when the listener stops dancing. You taught them that real power comes from composure, the ability to wait until truth reveals itself naturally. You made them see that arguments based on ego always fall out of tune. Their panic was not about losing to you. It was about realizing how fragile their cleverness truly was. They could no longer mask insecurity with eloquence. The rhythm died, and with it, the illusion of superiority. You learned that letting others lose their rhythm is far more powerful than trying to break it. You became a living contradiction, present but untouchable, engaged but immune. You stopped feeding their rhythm and started controlling the pace. They could feel it. Their confidence drained every time they spoke. Their words stumbled over each other as if their own mind no longer trusted the script. The manipulation failed not because you fought harder, but because you stopped fighting entirely. That's the paradox they'll never understand. Power doesn't shout, it waits, it observes. And in that waiting, every false rhythm eventually self-destructs.